spectacular program. Two wonderful stories by Bram Stoker. I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about Bram Stoker, but just to give you a little bit of a background, he is, of course, the author of Dracula. He did not start as an author. He actually started as a lawyer, actually. He went to college, and his father insisted he was going to be a lawyer. So he did do that for a while, but the biggest thing he did in his career for over 30 years was to be the theater manager for a very famous British actor, Henry Irving. And they toured all over this country and all over Europe and stuff like that. He was with him for a long time, but he decided that he wanted to not be in the shadows so much as he was, just being a theater manager. So he started writing, and of course we all know the popularity of Dracula, but he also, and I just discovered this, the two things that we'll be reading are two stories from a book called Bram Stoker's Bedtime Stories. So they're appropriately creepy for Halloween. I found this actually in a little tiny bookshop on Madison Avenue. Brothers Bookshop. It was just standing there. I went, oh, this looks interesting. And so I got it, and I decided to adapt two of my favorite stories in it. There's about a dozen in it, but these are my two favorites because they're the creepiest, I guess. So we're very pleased to bring that to you. Unusual for us, there is going to be an intermission between the two stories. So we have Halloween treats and things like that out there. It'll be a 10-minute intermission. So welcome very much. It's lovely to see you all here tonight. And be there or be squared or scared. Scandals connected with the Delambre family or the Brents of Brent Rock were not few. And if the secret history of the county had been written in full, both names would have been found well represented. It is true that the status of each was so different that they might have belonged to different continents, or different worlds for that matter. For hitherto their orbs had never crossed. The Brents were accorded by the whole section of the country a unique social dominance, and held themselves as high above the yeoman class to which Margaret Delambre belonged. The Delambre had an ancient record and were proud of it in their way, as the Brents were of theirs. But their family had never risen above the yeomanry, and although they had once been well-to-do in the good old times of foreign wars, their fortunes had withered under the scorching of free trade sun and the piping times of peace. They had stuck to the land, with the result that they had taken root in it, choosing a life of farming which blossomed and thrived in good seasons and suffered in bad. Their holding, Dander's Croft, seemed to have been worked out and to be typical of the family which inhabited it. The latter declined generation after generation as the family dropped lower and lower, the men brooding and dissatisfied and drinking themselves into the grave, the women drudging at home or marrying beneath them, or worse. In the process of time, all disappeared, leaving only two in the croft, Wickham Delandre and his sister Margaret. The man and woman seem to have inherited in masculine and feminine form, respectively, the evil tendency of their race, sharing in common the principles, though in diverse ways, of sullen passions, voluptuousness, and recklessness.
The history of the Brents have been something similar, but showing the causes of decadence in their aristocratic and not their plebeian forms. For without flaw they were gallant and brave. Deeds were done by them before the selfish dissipation which marked them had sapped their vigor. The present head of the family, if family it could be called when only one remained of the direct line, was Geoffrey Brent. He was almost a type of a worn-out race, manifesting in some ways its most brilliant qualities, and in others its utter degradation. He was certainly handsome, with that dark, aquiline, commanding beauty which women so generally recognize as dominant. With men, he was distant and cold, but there was hardly a woman of any kind of degree who lived within view of Brent's Rock who did not cherish some form of secret admiration for the handsome wastrel.
So long as Geoffrey confined his dissipations to London, Paris, and Vienna, anywhere out of sight and sound of his home, opinion was silent. But when the scandal came close to home, it was another matter. Still, there was a certain reticence in all, and so no more notice was taken of the existing fact than was absolutely necessary. Margaret Delandre bore herself so fearlessly and openly, she accepted her position so naturally as the justified companion of Geoffrey Brent, that people came to believe that she was secretly married to him, and therefore they thought it wiser to hold their tongues, lest time should justify her and also make her an active enemy.
One person who, by his interference, could have settled all doubts was debarred by circumstances from interfering in the matter. Wickham Delandre had quarreled with his sister, or perhaps it was she who had quarreled with him, and they were on terms not merely of armed neutrality, but of bitter hatred. There had certainly been threats on one side and the other, and in the end, Wickham, overcome with passion, ordered his sister to leave the house. "You foul wench! You have dragged the name of Delandre through the muck and mire of your animalistic and lustful behaviors. And now I hear that you have taken up with our arch enemy, that foul swine, Geoffrey Brent. How could you disgrace our family name with your wantonness and make us the subject of the vile gossip of the common herd?"
Ha! As if your own drunken dissipations haven't fueled the fire of the poisonous gossip-mongering tongues of the villagers. Your alcoholic excesses and mad ravings and virtual destruction of our house and holdings have long ago ruined what little reputation this family had. You are the laughingstock of the entire county.
Enough! I have had enough of your vile tongue and whorish ways. Get out of this house now! You are nothing but a selfish and self-serving strumpet who pollutes the very air with your depravity.
Oh, I shall go immediately. I spit on you in the ruins of this once prideful estate. One day bastard brother of mine, you shall rue in shame and despair your acts of this day to the last day of your miserable, worthless life. Some weeks had passed, and it was understood in the neighborhood that Margaret had gone to London, where she suddenly appeared driving out with Geoffrey Brent. The entire neighborhood knew before nightfall that she had taken up abode at Brent's Rock.
Wickham was furious at the news. He vowed vengeance, and to keep his mind level with his passions, drank deeper than ever. He tried several times to see his sister, but she contemptuously refused to meet him. He tried to have an interview with Brent, but he refused to see him also. At last, Wickham Delandre sank down to a morose, vengeful acceptance of the situation.
Neither Margaret nor Geoffrey was of a pacific temperament, and it was not long before there began quarrels between them. One thing would lead to another, and wine flowed freely at Brent's Rock. But such quarrels generally ended where domestic altercations do, in reconciliation, and in a mutual respect for the fighting qualities proportionate to their manifestation. Fighting for its own sake is found by a certain class of persons all the world over to be a matter of absorbing interest, and there is no reason to believe that domestic conditions minimize its potency. Geoffrey and Margaret made occasional absences from Brent's Rock, but there came a time when the absence from Brent's Rock became longer than before. A trip to the continent had been mentioned before the servants, and after a few days, Wickham also went away, and it was some weeks before he returned. It was noticed that he was full of some new importance, satisfaction, exultation. They hardly knew how to call it. He went straightway to Brent's Rock and demanded to see Geoffrey Brent, and on being told that he had not yet returned, said with a grim decision which the servants noted,
I shall come again. My news is solid. It can wait.
Week after week and month after month went by, and then there came a rumor, certified later on, that an accident had occurred in Zermatt Valley. While crossing a dangerous pass, the carriage containing an English lady and the driver had fallen over a precipice. The gentleman of the party, Mr. Geoffrey Brent, having been fortunately saved as he had been walking up the hill to ease the horses. He gave information, and a search was made. The broken rail, the excoriated roadway, the marks where the horses struggled on the decline before finally pitching over into the river, all told the sad tale. All searches were made, and the body of one horse was found in an eddy of the river. Later on, the body of the driver was found further down the eddy of the river, but the body of the lady, like that of the other horse, had disappeared.
Wickham Delandre made all enquiries possible, but could not find any trace of the missing woman. He found, however, in the books of various hotels, the name of Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Brent. He had a stone erected at Zermatt to his sister's memory under her maiden name, and a tablet put up at the church at Breton, the parish in which Brent's Rock and Dander's Croft were situated. There was a lapse of nearly a year after the excitement had worn away, and the whole neighborhood had gone on in its accustomed way. Brent was still absent, and Delandre more drunken and more revengeful than before.
Then there was new excitement. Brent's Rock was being made ready for a new mistress. It was officially announced by Geoffrey himself in a letter to the vicar that he had married an Italian lady and that they were now on their way home. Then a small army of workmen invaded the house. The south wing of the house was entirely redone, and many of the workmen left, leaving only the materials for the doing of the old hall when Geoffrey Brent should return, for he left instructions that the decoration was only to be done under his eyes. He had brought with him the accurate drawings of a hall in the house of his bride's father, for he wished to reproduce for her the place to which she had become accustomed. As the molding had all to be redone, some scaffolding poles and boards were brought in and laid on one side of the great hall, and also a great wooden tank for mixing the lime, which was laid in bags beside it. When the new mistress of Brent's Rock arrived, the bells of the church rang out. There was general jubilation. She was a beautiful creature, full of poetry and the fire and passion of her native land. The English words she had learned were spoken in such a rare, sweet way that she won the hearts of the people almost as much by the music of her voice as the beauty of her dark eyes.
Geoffrey Brent seemed more happy than he had ever before appeared. But there was a dark, anxious look on his face that was new to those who knew him of old. He stared at times, as though at some noise that was unheard by others. And so, months passed, and the whisper grew that at last Brent's Rock was to have an heir. Geoffrey was very tender to his wife, and the new bond between them seemed to soften him. He seemed to have set all his hopes on the child that was coming, and as he looked deeper into the future, the dark shadow that had come over his face seemed to die gradually away.
All this time, Wykham Delandre nursed his revenge. Deep in his heart had grown a purpose of vengeance, which only waited for the opportunity to crystallize and take shape. He had been drinking heavily for some time and was more than half stupefied. Presently he forgot all around him and sank into a daze, but suddenly awoke to see something standing before him, someone or something like a battered, ghostly edition of his sister. For a few moments there came upon him a sort of fear. The woman before him, with distorted features and burning eyes, seemed hardly human, and the only thing that seemed like a reality of his sister as she had been was her wealth of golden hair, and this was now streaked with gray. She eyed her brother with a long, cold stare, and he, too, as he looked and began to realize the actuality of her presence, found the hatred of her which he had once again found surging up in his heart. "Why are you here? You're dead and buried!"
I am here, Wykham Delandre, for no love of you, but because I hate another even more than I do you.
Him?
Yes, him. But make no mistake. My revenge is my own, and I merely need you to help me to it.
Did he marry you?
So you would like to know? It would please your pride to feel your sister was truly married. Well, you shall not know. This is my revenge on you, and I do not mean to change it by a hair's breadth. I have come here tonight simply to let you know that I am alive, so that if any violence be done me where I am going, there may be a witness.
Where are you going?
That is my affair, and I have not the least intention of letting you know.
I will follow you through the darkness by the light of your hair and your so-called beauty.
There are others besides you who would ruin my hair and my beauty too, as he will. Though the beauty be gone. When he withdrew the linchpin of the carriage and sent us over the precipice into the torrent, he had little thought of my beauty. Perhaps his beauty would be scarred like mine if he were whirled as I was among the rocks of the Visp and frozen on the ice pack in the drift of the river. But let him beware, his time is coming.
Later on that night, the new Mrs. Brent, who was but half asleep, became suddenly awake and spoke to her husband. "Geoffrey, was not there the click of a lock somewhere below our window?" But Geoffrey, though she thought he too had started at the noise, seemed sound asleep and breathed heavily. Again, Mrs. Brent dozed, but this time awoke to the fact that her husband had arisen and was partially dressed. He was deadly pale. And when the light of the lamp which she had in his hand fell on his face, she was frightened at the look in his eyes. "What is it, Geoffrey? What are you doing?"
Hush, little one. Go to sleep. I am restless and wish to finish some work I have left undone.
"Bring it here, my husband. I am lonely, and I fear when you are away." For a reply, he merely kissed her and went out, closing the door behind him. She lay awake for a while, and then nature asserted itself and she fell asleep. Suddenly, she started broad awake at the sound of a smothered cry. She ran to the door and called out, "Geoffrey! Geoffrey!"
After a few moments, the door of the great hall opened, and Geoffrey appeared in it, but without his lamp. "Hush! Get to bed. I am working and must not be disturbed. Go to sleep and do not wake the house."
With a chill in her heart, for the harshness of her husband's voice was new to her, she crept back into bed and lay there trembling and listened to every sound. There was a long pause of silence, and then the sound of some iron implement striking muffled blows. Then came the clang of a heavy stone falling, followed by a muffled curse. Then a dragging sound, and then more noise of stone on stone. She lay still all the while in the agony of fear. She heard a curious sort of scraping sound, and then there was silence. Presently the door opened gently, and Geoffrey appeared. He pretended to be asleep, but through her eyelashes she saw him wash from his hands something white that looked like lime. In the morning, he made no allusions to the previous night, and she was afraid to ask any questions.
From that day there seemed to be some shadow over Geoffrey Brent. He neither ate nor slept as he had been accustomed, and his former habit of turning suddenly as though someone were speaking from behind him was revived. The old hall seemed to have some kind of fascination for him. He used to go there many times in the day, but grew impatient of anyone, even his wife, entered it. When the builder's foreman came to inquire about continuing his work, Geoffrey was out crying. The man went into the hall, and when Geoffrey returned, the servant told him of the foreman's arrival and where he was. With a frightful oath, he pushed the servant aside and hurried up to the old hall. The workman met him almost at the door, and as Geoffrey burst into the room, he ran against him. The man apologized.
Beg your pardon, sir, but I was just going out to make some inquiries. I directed 12 sacks of lime to be sent here, but I see there are only 10.
Can the 10 sacks and the 12 too?
I see, sir, but there is a little matter which our people must have done, but the governor will, of course, see it right at his own cost.
What do you mean?
That there hearthstone, sir. Some idiot must have put a scaffold pole on it and cracked it right down the middle, and it's thick enough you'd think it'd stand anything.
Tell your people I am not going on with the work in the hall at present. I want to leave it as it is for a while longer.
All right, sir. I'll send up a few of our chaps to take away these poles and the lime bags and tidy up the place a bit.
No, leave them where they are. I shall send a letter and tell you when you are to get on with the work.
Right, sir. I will send the bill for the work already done. It appears to me that maybe money's a little shaky for you just now.
You will have your money, and I'll have no more of your insolence.
Rightio, sir.
Once or twice over the next few days, Wickham the launderer tried to stop the Brents on the road, and finding he could not attain his purpose, rode after the carriage, calling out, "What has become of my sister, your wife? What have you done with her?" Brent lashed his horses into a gallop, and the launderer, seeing from his white face and his wife's collapse, almost to a faint, that his goal was attained, he rode away with a scowl and a laugh.
That night, when Geoffrey went into the hall, he passed over to the great fireplace, and all at once started back with a smothered cry. Then, with an effort, He pulled himself together and went away and returned with a light. He bent down over the broken hearthstone to see if the moonlight falling through the many-storied window had in any way deceived him. Then, with a groan of anguish, he sank to his knees. There, sure enough, through the crack in the broken stone, were protruding a multitude of threads of golden hair, just tinged with gray. He was disturbed by a noise at the door, and looking around, saw his wife standing in the doorway. In the desperation of the moment, he took action to prevent discovery, and, lighting a match to the lamp, stooped down and burned away the hair that rose through the broken stone. Then, rising as nonchalantly as he could, he pretended surprise at seeing his wife beside him.
For the next week he lived in an agony. Whether by accident or design, he could not find himself alone in the hall for any length of time. At each visit, the hair had grown afresh through the crack, and he had to watch it carefully lest his terrible secret should be discovered. He tried to find a receptacle for the body of the murdered woman, but someone always interrupted him. And once, when he was coming out of the private doorway, he was met by his wife, who began to question him about it, and manifested surprise that she should not have before noticed the key, which he now reluctantly showed her. Geoffrey dearly and passionately loved his wife, so that any possibility of her discovering his dread secrets, or even of doubting him, filled him with anguish. But after a couple of days had passed, he could not help coming to the conclusion that she suspected something.
That very evening, she came into the hall after her drive and found him there sitting moodily by the deserted fireplace. "Geoffrey, I have been spoken to by that fellow Delandre, and he says horrible things. He tells me that his sister returned to this house, the wreck and ruin of her former self, with only her golden hair as of old, and announced some fell intention. He asked me where she is, and, oh, Geoffrey, she's dead. She is dead. So how can she have returned? Oh, I am in dread, and I know not where to turn."
For answer, Geoffrey burst into a torrent of blasphemy which made her shudder. He cursed Delandre and his sister and all their kind, and especially he hurled curse after curse on her golden hair. In his torrent of anger, he stood up and moved away from the hearth, but suddenly stopped as he saw a new look of terror in his wife's eyes. He followed their glance, and then he too shuddered. For there on the broken hearthstone lay a golden streak as the point of the hair rose through the crack.
"Look! Look! Is it some ghost of the dead? Come away! Come away!" And seizing him by the wrist, with the frenzy of madness, she pulled him from the room.
That night, she was in a raging fever. The doctor of the district attended her at once, and special aid was telegraphed for a doctor in London. Geoffrey was in despair, and in his anguish at the danger to his young wife, almost forgot his own crime and its consequences. In the evening, the local doctor had to leave to attend to others, and left Geoffrey in charge of his wife. His last words were, "Remember, you must humor her till I come in the morning, or till some other doctor has her case in hand. What you have to dread is another attack of emotion. See that she is kept warm. Nothing more can be done."
Late in the evening, when the rest of the household had retired, Geoffrey's wife got up from her bed and called out to her husband. "Come! Come to the old hall! I know where the gold comes from! I want to see it grow!"
Geoffrey would fain have stopped her, but feared for her life for reason, on the one hand, and lest in a paroxysm of horror she should shriek out her terrible suspicion, seeing it was useless to try and prevent her, wrapped her in a warm rug and went with her to the old hall. When they entered, she turned to the door and shut and locked it.
"We want no strangers among us three tonight.
"We three? Nay, we are but two."
Sit here. Sit here by the hearth and watch the gold grow. The silver moonlight is jealous. See, it steals along the floor towards the gold, our gold. Now do not stir, dear. Let us sit and watch. We shall find the secret of the gold glowing.
Geoffrey looked down with growing fear and saw that during the hours that had passed, the golden hair had protruded farther through the broken hearthstone. His wife had drawn her chair next to him and put her head on his shoulder. He passed his arm around her and sat silent, and as the moonlight stole along the floor, she sank to sleep. He feared to wake her, so sat silent and miserable as the hours stole away. Before his horror-struck eyes, the golden hair from the broken stone grew and grew, and as it increased, so his heart got colder and colder, till at last he had no power to stir, and sat with eyes full of terror, watching his doom.
In the morning, when the London doctor came, neither Geoffrey nor his wife could be found. Search was made in all the rooms, but without avail. And at last resort, the door of the great hall was broken open, and those who entered saw a grim and sorry sight. There, before the deserted hearth, Geoffrey Brent and his young bride sat cold and white and dead. Her face was peaceful, and her eyes were closed in sleep. But his face was a sight that made all who saw it shudder, for there was on it a look of unutterable horror. His eyes were open and stared glassily at the floor, from which tresses of golden hair streaked with gray came through the broken hearthstone, entwining the doomed couple in its deadly embrace.
When the time for his examination drew near, Malcolm Malcolmson made up his mind to go somewhere to read by himself. He feared the attraction of the seaside, and also he feared complete rural isolation. For of old, he knew of their charms and distractions, and so he determined to find some unpretentious small town where there would be nothing to divert him from his studies. As Malcolmson had no wish to encumber himself with the attentions of friends, and friends of friends, he determined to look out for a place for himself. He packed a portmanteau with some clothes and all the books he would require, and then took a train ticket for the first name on the local timetable he did not know. When at the end of the 3-hour journey he alighted at Benchurch, he felt satisfied that he had so far obliterated his tracks, as to be sure of having a peaceful opportunity of pursuing his studies. He went straight to the one which the sleepy little place contained, and put up for the night. Malcolmson looked around the day after his arrival to find quarters, even more isolated quarters than even so quiet an inn as the good traveler afforded.
Now here is a place which interested me. Old rambling, heavy-built house built in the Jacobean style. The heavy gables, smallish windows built higher than is customary, and the massive brick wall. It looks more of a fortification than a house, and it does seem like it is uninhabited at present. Here is the very spot I am looking for. If I can get the opportunity to rent part of it, I shall be very happy.
From the post office, he got the name of the agent, who rarely received an application to rent part of the old house. Mr. Cranford, the local lawyer and agent, frankly confessed his delight at anyone being willing to live in the house. "To tell you the truth, sir, I should only be too happy on behalf of the owners to let anyone have the house rent-free for a term of a year, if only to accustom the people here to see it inhabited. It has been so long empty that some kind of absurd prejudice has grown around and about it, and this can best be put down by its occupation, if only by a scholar like yourself who wants its quiet for a time."
Malcolmson thought it needless to ask the agent about the absurd prejudice. He knew he would get more information on that subject from other quarters. He paid his 3 months' rent, got a receipt and the name of a woman who would undertake to do for him, and came away with the keys in his pocket. He went then to the landlady of the inn and asked her advice as to such stores and provisions as he would be likely to require. She threw up her hands in amazement when he told her where he was going to settle himself.
Not in the judge's house!
Aye, sure enough, the very place. Can you tell me something about the house? Why is it so called, and what exactly is against it?
It is so called locally because it has been many years before, perhaps 100 years or more. It was the abode of a judge who was held in great terror on account of his harsh sentences and his hostility to the prisoners of the court. As to what was against the house itself, no one could inform me, but there is a general feeling that there is something, and for my own part, I would not take the money and drink water's bank and stay in the house an hour by myself. It is too bad of me, sir, and you, a young gentleman too, if you will pardon my saying it, going to live there all alone. You would not sleep there one night, not if I had to go there myself and pull the alarm bell that is on the roof.
But my dear Mrs. Wickham, indeed you must not be concerned about me. A man who is reading for the mathematical tripos has too much to think of to be disturbed by any of these mysterious somethings. Now I must go and meet with my new housekeeper. If you would be so kind to see to the delivery of my provisions, I will meet you at the judge's house in a couple of hours.
When he returned with a Mrs. Dempster, the woman he had engaged to do housekeeping for him, he found Mrs. Wickham herself waiting with several men carrying parcels, and an upholsterer's man with a bed in his car. "I have taken the liberty, sir, of providing a new bed for you. For as the tables and chairs inside might do very well, a bed that has not been aired for 50 years or more is not proper for young bones to lie on.
That is truly kind and thoughtful of you, Mrs. Whitman. Now come with me and help me decide which room I shall choose for my temporary new abode.
I shall, sir, if only you promise to stay close at hand. I surely do not feel comfortable in this old house.
After his examination of the house, Malcolmson decided to take up his abode in the great dining room, which was big enough to serve all his requirements. Mrs. Wickham, with the aid of Mrs. Dempster, proceeded to arrange matters. When all was set up to her satisfaction, she expressed all sorts of kind wishes to the young man, and at the door she gave him one last piece of advice.
And perhaps, sir, as the room is big and drafty, it might be well to have one of those big screens put round your bed at night. Though truth to tell, I would die myself if I were to be so shut in with all kinds of things that put their eyes around the sides or over the top and look on me. And with that frightening image, she quickly fled the premises.
Mrs. Dempster sniffed in a superior manner as the landlady disappeared, and remarked that for her own part, she was not afraid of all the bogies in the kingdom.
I'll tell you what is, sir. Bogies is all kinds and all sorts of things, except bogies. Rats and mice and beetles, and creaky doors and loose slates and broken panes, and stiff drawer handles that stay out when you pull them and then fall down in the middle of the night. Look at the wainscot of the room. It's old, hundreds of years old. You think there's no rats and beetles there? And do you imagine, sir, that you will not see more of them? Rats is bogies, I tell you, and bogies is rats. And don't you get to think anything else.
My good woman, I heartily thank you for your information, and I agree with you completely. I have come here to work in solitude, and if I have some company from the house's current residents, it will be a welcome occasional diversion from my studies.
Oh, you young gentlemen, you don't fear for naught, and likely you'll get all the solitude you want here.
She set to work with her cleaning, and by nightfall, when Malcolmson returned from his walk, he found the room swept and tidy, a fire burning in the old hearth, the lamp lit, and the table spread for supper.
This is comfort indeed.
When he finished his supper, he got out his books again and set himself down for a spell of hard work. He went on without pause until about 11 o'clock, when he knocked off for a bit, made himself some strong tea, and settled in a comfortable chair to revel in the sense of isolation from his kind. Then it was when he began to notice for the first time what a noise the rats were making. How busy they were. Up and down behind the old wainscot, over the ceiling and under the floor, they raced and gnawed and scratched.
Bogies is rats and rats is bogies.
The tea began to have its effect of intellectual and nervous stimulants, and before he settled down for more work, he allowed himself the luxury of a good look around the room. He wondered how such a quaint and beautiful house had been so neglected. The wainscot was fine and of rare merit on the oak panels around the doors and the windows. There were some old pictures on the walls, but they were so coated with dust and dirt he could not distinguish any detail of them. The thing that most struck him, however, was the rope of the great alarm bell on the roof, which hung down in a corner of the room on the right side of the fireplace. He pulled up the hearth, a great carved back chair carved of oak, and sat down with his last cup of tea.
He suddenly looked up, and there was in the air that sense of the hour before dawn, which is so dread to doubtful life. He arose and went to his work table to see where he had left off, when he realized that the noise of the rats had ceased, and it was the sudden sensation which had disturbed him. The fire had fallen low, but it still threw out a deep red glow. As he looked, he started back in unpleasant surprise.
There on the high-backed carved oak chair, to the right of the fireplace, sat an enormous rat glaring at him with baleful eyes. He made a motion toward it as though to chase it away, but it did not stir. Then he made a motion of throwing something, but it still did not stir. Instead, the rat showed its great white teeth angrily, and its cruel eyes shone in the lamplight with an added vindictiveness. Malcolmson felt amazed, and seizing the poker from the hearth, ran at it to kill it. Before he could strike it, the rat, with a skreek that sounded like a concentration of hate, jumped on the floor and, running up the rope of the alarm bell, disappeared into the darkness. Instantly, the noisy scampering of the rats in the wainscot began again.
By this time, Malcolmson's mind was quite off his books and mathematical problems, and a shrill cockcrow outside told him of the approach of morning. He fell into bed and was immediately asleep.
He slept so soundly that he was not even woken by Mrs. Dempster coming in to make up his room. It was only when she had tidied up the place and got his breakfast ready and tapped on the screen which closed his bed that he woke. He was tired after his night's work, but a strong cup of tea soon refreshened him up, out for his morning walk.
On his return, he stopped in to see Mrs. Witham to thank her for her kindness. She looked at him searchingly and shook her head and said, "You must not overdo it, sir. You are paler this morning than you should be. 2 late hours and too much work on the brain is not good for any man. But tell me, sir, how did you pass the night?" "Well, I hope. But my heart, sir, I was glad when Mrs. Dempster told me this morning that you were all right and sleeping sound when she went in."
I was all right. The somethings did not worry me yet. Only the rats. They had a circus all over the place. There was one wicked old devil that sat up on my own chair by the fire and would not go until I took the poker to him. And then he ran up the rope to the alarm bell and got to somewhere up in the wall or the ceiling. I could not see where. It was so dark.
Mercy on us! An old devil and sitting on a chair by the fireside. Oh, take care, sir, take care. There is many a true word spoken in jest.
How do you mean? Upon my word, I don't understand.
An old devil! The old devil, perhaps. There, sir, you need not laugh. You young folks think it's easy to laugh at things that make older folks shudder. Oh, never mind, sir. Please God, you will laugh all the time. It is what I wish for myself.
Forgive me. Don't think me rude, but look, the idea was too much for me. That the old devil himself was on the chair last night?
This evening, the scampering of the rats began earlier. Tonight, the rats disturbed him more than the previous night. Getting bolder by degrees, they came to the mouths of their holes and to the cracks and crannies of the wainscoting, till their eyes shone like tiny lamps. And as the early part of the night wore on, and despite the noise, Malcolmson got increasingly immersed in his work.
All at once he stopped, as on the previous night, being overcome by a sudden sense of silence. And then a very odd sensation thrilled through him. There, on the great high-backed carved oak chair beside the fireplace, sat the same enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. Instinctively, he took the nearest thing at hand, a book of logarithms, and flung it at it. The book was badly aimed, and the rat did not stir. So again he grabbed the poker, and the rat, being actively pursued, fled up the rope of the alarm bell.
On looking at his watch, he found it was close to midnight, and not sorry for this latest diversion, he made up his fire and made himself his nightly pot of tea. While sipping his tea, he began to think that he would like to know where the rat disappeared to. Accordingly, he lit another lamp and placed it so that it would shine well into the right-hand corner of the wall by the fireplace. He then got all the books he had brought with him and placed them handy to throw at the vermin. Finally, he lifted the rope of the alarm bell and placed the end of it on the table, fixing the extreme end under the lamp. As he handled it, he could not help noticing how pliable it was, especially for so strong a rope.
You could hang a man with it. Oh well. My preparations for a return visit from the overgrown vermin are complete. I think I shall learn something about him this time.
Again, he was suddenly called to his immediate surroundings. This time, it might not have been only the sudden silence which caught his attention. There was a slight movement of the rope, and the lamp also moved. Without stirring, he looked to see if his pile of books were in range, and then he cast his eye along the rope. As he looked, he saw the great rat drop from the rope to the oak armchair and sit there glaring at it. He raised the book in his right hand and, taking careful aim, flung it at the rat. The latter, with a quick movement, sprang aside and dodged the missile. He then took another book and a third and flung them one after the other, but each time unsuccessfully. At last, he stood with a book in his hand to throw. The rat squeaked and seemed afraid. This made Malcolmson more than ever eager to strike, and the book flew and struck the rat a resounding blow. It gave a terrified squeal, and turning on his pursuer a look of terrible malevolence, ran up the chair back and made a great jump to the rope of the alarm bell and ran up it like lightning. Malcolmson kept his eyes on the rat and saw by the light of the second lamp it leapt to a molding of the wainscot and disappeared through a hole in one of those great pictures which hung on the wall, obscured and invisible through its coating of dirt and dust.
I shall look up my friend's habitation in the morning. The third picture from the fireplace. I shall not forget. Now for the book that fetched me. Lord, the Bible my mother gave me. What an odd coincidence.
He slept heavily but uneasily, and dreamed much. And when Mrs. Dempster woke him in the morning, he seemed ill at ease, and for a moment did not seem to realize exactly where he was. His first request rather surprised the housekeeper.
Mrs. Dempster, when I'm out today, I wish you would get the steps and dust or wash those pictures, especially the third from the fireplace. I want to see what they are.
But whatever for, sir? Them pictures have been buried in grime for nigh on 100 years or more. I wager that anything painted on them would have rotted many years ago.
I have my reasons, Mrs. Dempster. I will thank you to be so kind as to not question them.
But of course, sir, if that is your wish, it shall be done. You have been so good to me in our brief acquaintance. There's nothing I would not do to show my appreciation for your kindness so far.
Late in the afternoon, Malcolmson looked at his books in the shaded wall and solved a particularly thorny mathematical problem. So it was in a state of jubilation that he paid a visit to Mrs. Witham at the Good Traveler. He found a stranger in the cozy sitting room who was introduced to him as Dr. Thornhill. She was not quite at ease, and this, combined with the doctor's plunging at once into a series of questions, made Malcolmson come to the conclusion that his presence was not an accident. So, without preliminary, he said,
Dr. Thornhill, I shall with pleasure answer you any question you may choose to ask me, if you will answer me one question first.
"Done! What is it?"
Did Mrs. Witham ask you to come here and see me and advise me?
"She did, but she did not intend you to know. I suppose it was my clumsy haste that made you suspect. She told me she did not like the idea of you being in that house all by yourself, and she thought that you took too much strong tea. In fact, she wants me to advise you, if possible, to give up the tea and the very late hours. I was a keen student in my time, so I suppose I may take the liberty of a college man and without offense advise you as not quite a stranger.
Shake, as they say in America. I must thank you for your kindness, and Mrs. Wickham too, and your kindness deserves a return on my part. I promise to take no more strong tea, no tea at all until you let me, and I shall go to bed tonight at 1 o'clock at the latest. Will that do?
Capital! Now tell us all you noticed in that old house.
And so Malcolmson then and there told them in minute detail all that happened in the last 2 nights. Dr. Thornhill listened with a face of growing gravity, and then, when the narrative was complete, he asked,
The rat always went up the rope of the alarm bell?
Always.
I suppose you know what the rope is.
No.
It is the very rope which the hangman used for all the victims of the judge's judicial rancor.
Oh, that knowledge bears much thought. I thank you, Dr. Thornhill, for that bit of information. Now, I see by the time I must take my leave, have my dinner, and get back to my studies, if I am to finish them by 1 o'clock, as you so have prescribed. Farewell to you both.
Doctor, whatever did you mean by putting such horrible ideas into that poor young man's mind? He has quite enough there to upset him.
My dear madam, I had a distinct purpose in it. I wanted to draw his attention to the bell rope and to fix it there. It may be that he is in a highly overwrought state with his recounting of the rats, and even the suggestion of the devil. He may get in the night some strange fright or hallucination, and if he does, I want him to pull that rope. All alone as he is, it will give us warning, and we may reach him in time to be of service. I shall be sitting up late tonight and shall keep my ears open. Do not be surprised if Benchurch gets a surprise before morning.
Oh, Doctor, what do you mean? What do you mean?
I mean this, that possibly, nay, more probably, we shall hear the great bell from the judge's house tonight.
When Malcolmson arrived home, he was glad to see the place was bright and tidy, with a cheerful fire and a well-trimmed lamp. The evening was colder than usual for April, and a heavy wind was blowing, heralding the promise of a storm. For a few minutes after his entrance, the almost ever-present noise of the rats ceased. But as soon as they became accustomed to his presence, they began again. He was glad to hear them, feeling almost a sense of companionship in their noise, which he remembered they only ceased to manifest when that other, the great rat with the baleful eyes, came upon the scene. For an hour or so he read, and then his thoughts began to wander from his books. By this time, the wind had become a gale, and a gale, a storm. The old house, solid though it was, seemed to shake to its foundations. Even the great alarm bell on the roof must have felt the force of the wind, for the rope rose and fell slightly, as though the bell moved a little from time to time, and the limber rope fell on the oak floor with a hard and hollow sound.
As Malcolmson listened to it, he thought to himself of the doctor's words. It is the rope which the hangman used for the victims of the judge's judicial rancor, and he went over to the corner of the fireplace, took it into his hands to look at it. There seemed to be a sort of deadly interest in it, and as he stood there, he lost himself for a moment in speculation as to who those victims were, and the grim wish of the judge to have such a ghastly relic ever under his eyes. All this set him thinking, and it occurred to him that he had not investigated the rat's lair or looked at the newly washed and dusted pictures as he intended. He lit the other lamp without the shade and went and stood opposite the third picture from the fireplace on the right-hand side where he had seen the rat disappear on the previous night. At first glance, he started back so suddenly that he almost dropped the lamp, and a deadly pallor overspread his face.
The portrait was of a judge dressed in his robes of scarlet and ermine. His face was strong and merciless, evil, crafty, and vindictive, with a sensual mouth, hooked nose of ruddy color, and shaped like the beak of a bird of prey. The rest of the face was of a cadaverous color. The eyes were of peculiar brilliance and with a terribly malignant expression. As he looked at them, Malcolmson grew cold, for he saw the very counterpart of the great rat. The lamp almost fell from his hand as he saw the rat with its baleful eyes peering out through the hole in the corner of the picture. The judge was seated in a great high-backed carved oak chair on the right side of a great stone fireplace, which, in the corner, a rope hung down from the ceiling, its end lying coiled on the floor.
With a feeling of something like horror, Malcolmson recognized the scene of the room as it stood around him, and gazed around as though he expected to find some strange presence behind him. Then he looked over to the corner of the fireplace, and with a loud cry, he let the lamp fall from his hand. For there, in the judge's armchair, with the rope hanging behind, sat the rat with the judge's brilliant eyes, now intensified with a fiendish leer. "This will not do. If I go on like this, I shall become a blithering fool, and this must stop. The doctor was right. My nerves must have been getting a very bizarre state. I promised the doctor I would not drink tea. But nothing was said about brandy and soda. That will surely call me just the tonic I need."
But before he could even finish his libation, Malcolmson heard a thin squeaking noise. He thought it might be the creaking of the rope, but looking up, he saw in the dim light the great rat clinging to the rope and gnawing it. The rope was already almost gnawed through, and in short order the rat had finished the job. The severed rope fell clattering to the floor. Then, with a ferocious squeal of triumph, the rat jumped to the floor and darted away, disappearing into the darkness.
Malcolmson determined then and there to stage an all-out hunt for the rat. He took off the green shade of the lamp to ensure a wider spreading light. As he did, the gloom of the upper part of the room was relieved, and in the new flood of light, the pictures on the walls stood out boldly. He saw right opposite him the third picture on the wall from the right of the fireplace. He rubbed his eyes in surprise, and then a great fear began to come upon him.
In the center of the picture was a great irregular patch of brown canvas, as fresh as it was before, with the chair, chimney corner, and the rope. But the figure of the judge had disappeared.
Malcolmson, in a chill of horror, turned slowly around, and then began to shake and tremble like a man in a palsy. His strength seemed to have left him, and he was incapable of action or movement, hardly even of thought. He could only see and hear.
There on the great high-backed carved oak chair sat the judge in his robes of scarlet and ermine, with his eyes glaring vindictively, and a smile of triumph on the resolute, cruel mouth, as he lifted with his hands a black cap.
Malcolmson felt as if his blood was running from his heart. There was singing in his ears. Outside, he could hear the roar and howl of the tempest, and though it came the striking of midnight by the great chimes in the marketplace, he stood for a space of time that seemed to him endless, still as a statue, and with wide open, horror-struck eyes, breathless.
As the clock struck, so did the smile of triumph on the judge's face intensify, and on the last stroke of midnight, he placed the black cap on his head. Slowly and deliberately, the judge rose from his chair and picked up the piece of the rope of the alarm bell which lay on the floor, drew it through his hands as if he enjoyed its touch, then deliberately began to knot one end of it, fashioning it into a noose. Then he began to move along the table on the opposite side to Malcolmson, keeping his eyes on him till he passed him, when with a quick movement he stood in front of the door.
Malcolmson then felt that he was trapped. There was some fascination in the judge's eyes, which never took off him. He saw the judge approach, keeping between him and the door, and raising the noose and throwing it towards him as if to entangle him. With great effort, he made a quick movement to one side and saw the rope fall beside him. Again, the judge raised the noose and tried to ensnare him, ever keeping his burning eyes fixed on him, and each time the student just managed to evade it. This went on many times, the judge never seeming discouraged or discomposed at failure, but play as a cat does with a mouse. At last, in despair, which had reached its climax, Malcolmson cast a quick glance around the room. He saw that the rope of the great alarm bell was laden with rats. Every inch of it was covered with them, and more were pouring through the small circular hole in the ceiling whence it emerged, so that with their weight, the bell was beginning to sway. It swayed till the clapper touched the bell. The sound was but a tiny one, but the bell was just beginning to sway, and it would increase.
At the sound, the judge, who had been keeping his eyes fixed on Malcolmson, looked up, and a scowl of diabolical anger overspread his face. His eyes glowed like hot coals, and he stamped his foot with a sound that seemed to make the house shake. A dreadful peal of thunder broke overhead as he raised the rope again, while the rats kept running up and down the rope as though working against time. This time, instead of throwing it, the judge drew close to his victim and held open the noose as he approached. As he came closer, there seemed something paralyzing in his very presence, and Malcolmson stood rigid as a corpse. He felt the judge's icy fingers touch his throat as he adjusted the rope. The noose tightened. Then the judge, taking the rigid form of the student in his arms, carried him over and placed him standing in the oak chair, and stepping up beside him, put his hand up and caught the end of the swaying rope of the alarm bell. As he raised his hand, the rats fled, squeaking, and disappeared through the hole in the ceiling. Taking the end of the noose, which was round Malcolmson's neck, he tied it to the hanging bell rope, and then, descending, pulled away the chair.
When the alarm bell of the judge's house began to sound, a crowd soon assembled.
Lights and torches of various kinds appeared, and soon a silent crowd was hurrying to the spot. They knocked loudly at the door, but there was no reply.
Then they burst in the door and poured into the great dining room, the doctor at the head.
There, at the end of the rope of the great alarm bell, hung the body of the student, and on the face of the judge in the picture was a malignant smile.
thank you so much. There's still some refreshments left. Please gather because I don't want to take them all home because I'll gain $55. And next, we're closing the season next month with Thurber Cavalcade. It's going to be a show about Ohio author James Thurber. The first part is an interview that he did with the Paris Review by George Clinton, and the second half is a bunch of his very quirky and fun stories.
What date? What date?
Oh, it's November 18th is the date. So it's a little earlier than we usually do it. But it's our last thing until next April, I think. So come if you can. Thank you very much. You're wonderful.